Okay, thank you. First of all, what's the relevance of this topic? Because, of course, it's a very exciting topic and a very exciting debate which goes on for quite a long period of time. But if we first decide why should we spend time during this session of Communist University in London now on that particular topic, we have to see also its relevance in terms of political strategies and in terms of understanding the current social and political problems, so that it goes beyond the academic historical debate. And we started formulating the topic of today's debate, focusing it on Russia, though, in fact, of course, Russia was never seen as the model for the Asiatic mode of production. At the same time, it was exactly because of that. In Russia, there was always a very serious debate to which extent the term could be applicable to Russian history. But anyhow, if we are speaking about the Asiatic mode of production as it was described by Marx, and as it was actually in many ways borrowed by Marx from previous Western writers, though without the term mode of production, but in the whole concept of Asiatic despotism or Asiatic society as being of a different kind compared to the European society. That comes from the 18th century, and I just recently tried to discover where the term came from. And on the one hand, it came from English reports from India, which were very actively quoted and used by Karl Marx. So these were mainly the documents, reports, letters, dispatches from British East Indian Company, which characterized local society and tried to show that the society was completely different from the European society, and also stressing the point that that society was based on despotic rule, and that despotic rule also neglected the property rights. And in that sense, it was the state which was kind of controlling everything, including every major aspect of production. And then, of course, the state itself was not subject to any kind of law, control, not to speak about civil society and so on. And then already in the 18th century, there was a very interesting debate in Gentleman's Magazine in London, where they discussed the origins of Asiatic mode of production. So already around that time, it was not just a purely ideological explanation. They were coming gradually to the idea that it had something to do with production. So Asiatic despotism, the Oriental despotism, as they described, they started seeing the relevance of, say, certain agricultural structures or organization. First of all, irrigational process, the process of the organization of irrigation by the state. It's a huge huge spaces which should be irrigated and organized, so you need strong state taking care of production. And by the way, British came to that idea also after a terrible disaster, which was very much of their own making, which was the Bengal famine of 1770, I think 7 or something. Well, in 1770s anyhow. The Bengal famine led to mass loss of lives, and even British themselves, they spoke about like probably 2 million or 3 million people who died. In fact, probably the number of victims was less because, well, all these reports tended to exaggerate, but nevertheless it was a major disaster which partly resulted from the neglect shown by the English administration in Bengal towards the whole process of irrigation and so on. And the other source of this theory is of course, French Enlightenment, which kept using the term Oriental despotism as a kind of justification of its own ideas of freedoms, human rights, respect towards property rights, and so on. And so it was basically like saying, okay, you're not in Turkey here, you're in France. So if you don't want to be like Turks, like barbaric Turks, or, by the way, barbaric Persians, that was also in the Encyclopedia of Diderot and d'Alembert. They spoke about barbarian rule in Persia and India. So they had three countries which they mentioned as examples of Oriental despotism. And of course, then it was a kind of paradigmatic appeal to the French government, to the European rulers, saying, well, if you don't want to be like these barbarians, you have to respect human rights, property rights, and so on. However, that debate became very relevant in Russia in the 1900s, because the big question was whether Russian society was feudal, Asiatic, or European. And in that sense, the whole set of political positions emerged. Because, in fact, if you see the basic core of the society, the traditional roots of the society as being part of that long-term, very conservative, self-reproducing, barbaric Asiatic structure, as they call it, Asiatic. By the way, Lenin made a distinction, said, I should call Russia an Asiatic society unless I get afraid to offend the Japanese. Anyhow, so that was the kind of debate. So if you see the society in that way, so any kind of capitalist development, any bourgeois modernization, should be presented in a very positive light, because it is very much about breaking the old conservative tradition, breaking the barbaric, undemocratic structures in the society itself, opening it up for democratic development, for the emergence of civil society, and in the long run also for the emergence of the left, of the labor movement, of the trade unions, and in the long run towards socialism. So, however, that kind of political logic led Mensheviks and some other Russian left-wingers to the need to establish united or rather popular front with the liberals, with the bourgeois forces. Because as long as you see the society as being so conservative and being reproducing the barbarian forms of despotism kind of automatically, bourgeois development looks like a necessary positive change. And that looks very much like a proper interpretation of Marx himself. Because, as I told you before, Marx in his writings on India also was, in a way positive about British Raj. Though very critical of British Raj from the moral point of view, from the human point of view, but saying, okay, it served the needs of progress. So in that respect, you can see bourgeois forces in Russia in 1917 as being progressive, and within this logic, it would be quite natural for the socialists, for social democrats and Marxists, to have an alliance with the liberals and with the bourgeois parties to break through and to create the preconditions for social and economic progress along European lines. And just jumping from that perspective to today's situation. I think that was very much the same problem which was debated in the third world countries, in the colonial and post-colonial countries, or other non-Western countries, time and again, especially when there were struggles which were oriented towards democratic change. There were always these positions. So some people were saying, look, given the circumstances, we have to make an alliance with the bourgeois forces for the future progress. And there were always groups and sections which were saying, no, we should not make this alliance, we should not subordinate the labor movement, the left, Marxist parties and groups to the bourgeois forces. And in fact, Lenin was trying to find some kind of third road in a way, speaking about the need, in 1905, for example, speaking about the need to have some kind of participation of the left, of the proletariat in the bourgeois project, in the project of bourgeois modernization. But he stressed the need for proletariat or for the left to hegemonize the process. So in that sense, yes, you have a bourgeois democratic revolution against all these traditionalist, feudal, Asiatic, and other non-modern structures, but you should not let bourgeoisie lead the movement, but rather we should lead the movement, and we have to be independent from the bourgeoisie. Rather, it would be probably the bourgeoisie which would be dependent on us. But again, it doesn't lead to a very clear strategic perspective, because what do you mean? That means that, does it mean that socialists and the labor movement should do the job for the bourgeoisie, insisting that, okay, we are going to do it better than the bourgeoisie itself? Or we will do the job for them, independently from them, and leading them in doing the job for them, right? So, of course, in technical terms, it's very understandable why Lenin was coming to that conclusion, but it was very clear that Lenin actually instinctively felt that there was something wrong with this kind of logic of socialists in the so-called bourgeois modernization. And I'm jumping back to the historic debate late in the 20th century, and in the last 20 years, I guess, there was an increasing uneasiness among left-wing, and not only left-wing historians, with this issue of Asiatic Oriental despotism. And the more we know about Oriental societies in the pre-colonial period, or the more we discover that the picture was very different compared to this initial simplistic picture of Asiatic or Oriental despotism. And the more we discover that, on the one hand, certain structures of Oriental societies were not so different compared the Western counterparts, the Western structures. There were differences, of course, and there were major differences, but were not as different as some historians or ideologues tended to present them. And on the other hand, we also discover that some Western structures, if we go deeper into Western history, they suddenly start showing striking similarities with certain Oriental structures, though these features were not usually discussed in more detail. But once you go into detail, you suddenly discover, yes, but some basic structures were very much the same, like communal structures, some early feudal structures, and some feudal and arrangements, some state arrangements, and so on. So you just compare the documents, and you see, well, they were not so different after all. Though, of course, the West was developing in a different way, and there were differences, but there was nothing which prevents these Asiatic structures to develop in the very same direction by itself, unless they were broken or destroyed by the West. And Also, what we discover when we go into more detail is that all of a sudden, so-called Western structures were extremely successful in their Oriental world, not as long as they were, as much as they were destroying and eliminating and overcoming these traditional structures, but on the contrary, they were very successful in subordinating these structures and using them for the needs of capitalist accumulation. And that is very much contrary to the original image which Marx had in his works on the British Raj in India, because it was basically, okay, English are going to overcome all these conservative structures. In fact, not only they failed to overcome these structures, but on the contrary, they made a tremendous effort to reproduce and reproduce and institutionalize these structures. So today, like Indian historians, for example, speak about English actually fixing the caste system in India through European legislation being introduced there to fix and regulate and, in fact, consolidate the caste system within the society through the means of European legislation. And the same debate comes back to Russia, because again we suddenly discover that well, all this modernization under Peter the Great and his successors was not that much about overcoming some most barbarian, most backward aspects of Russian society, but exactly was very much about consolidating these features. And that's like Serbia, for example, which was very much the result of modernization itself, because Russian peasants were more or less free. They were not completely free, but well, they were not more enslaved than their counterparts in many other parts of Europe by late 16th century. So, and then you see the increasing process of enslavement and serfment of the peasants, which goes hand in hand with attempts to modernize the state, to get Russia more and more involved in the global, the European trade and global trade, in the European division of labor. It goes hand in hand with the attempts of the Tsars to establish some kind of long-term strategic alliance with the queens and kings of England, which continued well into the 18th century. And if you read English press on Russia from the 18th century, there was a tremendous praise for Russian Tsars in the English press, like the Same Gentleman's Magazine and other publications. But especially what really actually made Marx very angry, though he did not really explain that, it was mainly the Whigs, not the Tories, who praised the Tsars. So the liberal wing of the British establishment, not the conservative one, which was just, I mean, jumping to praise everything Russian Tsars did. Well, and that continued with some minor interruptions well into the 19th century. So that kind of praise basically stopped with the Crimean War. And all of a sudden they discovered despotism in Russia. And then the whole language which later was used during the Cold War was already invented by the Economist in about 1850s. So if you read the Economist about 1855, it's almost like the Economist of 1955, you know, very much the same language, the same topics and so on. So that all leads to the general conclusion, which I tried to make in my book Empire of the Periphery, which is that capitalism, well, of course it did have some modernizing effort, but that modernizing effort was very limited, and it was never the attempt to overcome traditional structures. On the contrary, it was very much the attempt to exploit and use them for the sake of global or international capitalism. And in that sense, that was not not an alternative between, there was no alternative between capitalism and pre-capitalist modes of production, pre-capitalist. I don't know what's the English term for uklady. It's Lenin's term uklady, which I don't know how to translate it. It's very specific Lenin's term.
Layer?
Layer, because he's speaking about mode of production and uklady, which is less than a mode of production, something weaker than mode of production.
Social formation.
Social formation. Yeah, because he uses the term mode of production, and then something which is not yet a mode of production, which is subordinate to the mode of production, system, which is uklad, social system, or social systems. Speaking about different social systems, which was underneath, below the capitalist structure. And that means that once you discover that these traditional structures are in crisis, it's also capitalism, this particular type of capitalism, which is in crisis. And the other way around, when there is a crisis of capitalism, all the traditional structures are also in crisis. In that sense, there is no fundamentalist alternative to capitalism in that sense, because these structures which can produce fundamentalist movements, they themselves are also very much affected by the crisis of capitalism. The political conclusion which I think we have to make is that, left-wing movements, Marxist revolutionists, whatever, socialists should not subordinate their struggles to the needs of capital, even in the countries of the periphery. They should be independent, and they should fight against capitalism simultaneously with the fight against these backward and traditional structures. And they should not make that much difference between the first and the second category. And I think that the practical solutions which were discovered by Lenin himself during 1917 were exactly based on that very understanding, though it was never theorized that way, but it was very much, and that was exactly the problem of Russian Revolution in 1917. It was never properly theorized in these terms by its own actors. But I think that was basically the political strategic conclusion they made, which exactly made that revolution so successful and so important in the very beginning. But of course, then Hillel will tell us why a revolution failed in the long run, because the basic historic conditions were not very favorable. But still, I think that Lenin's kind of approach was right. Thank you.
Okay. This debate, I suppose, I'm actually entirely in agreement with Boris's conclusion. Surprise, surprise. How we wound up having this debate was that I wrote a review of Boris's book for the Weekly Worker over 2 issues of the Weekly Worker, and Hillel commented in an email to John that I was talking rubbish. John therefore thought this would make a debate. I think there are issues, the issues that he raises for me are perhaps slightly different issues, because in a sense, the issue which is being debated, which Boris, your book addresses, is in a sense a debate. Okay, most of the other European countries wind up becoming developed capitalist countries, imperialist countries. Why not Russia? And one of the possible explanations of this is to say, well, Russia isn't properly a European country, it's at least partially an Asiatic country. There are what's meant by Asiatic country, what's meant by the Asiatic mode of production. You gave us the history of where it comes from, which is, and before that, where it comes from, in fact, is the contrast made between by Greek and Roman historians, between Greek and Roman society, which had civil society, the polis, eunomia, the government by laws, and the barbarians, the Iranians, who had Asiatic despotism and no respect for property, and no respect for private property, and no civil society. And of course, they were expressing, these authors, a genuine contrast between the Achaemenid and Sasanian Iranian regimes and the Greek and Roman regimes. Essentially, the difference is this, that the Romans would go into a city, conquer it, kill off loads of people, carry the rest off, and sell them as slaves on the open market to private purchasers. The Iranians would go into a city, kill off a large number of the inhabitants, carry them off, and settle them in some other part of the Iranian Empire as slaves of the state. Yeah. And that is a difference, it's a genuine difference, but then it's perhaps not quite such a big difference, because in fact it means that both of these societies are, in Marxist terms, societies founded on the exploitation of slave labour. The surplus product is produced by the appropriation of people and their labour as slaves. And both societies have the same as slave societies dynamic, that they have to constantly conquer and raid at the periphery, and that they run into trouble when their constant conquest and raiding at the periphery produces state formation at the periphery, which produces that they come into conflict with people capable of resisting them. Of course, what happens to the Roman Empire, from the Roman point of view, is that it spreads far enough east that it comes into collision with the Sasanian Empire, and then a Cold War ensues in which ever more expensive armaments are deployed on both sides, and finally meanwhile state formation takes place in Germany and on the Danube, and finally the German and Danubian barbarians break into the Western Roman Empire, and finally, at last, the Arabs, the exhaustion of both the Roman and the Sasanian empires leads to the Arabs in the form of Islam breaking into the Eastern Roman Empire and into the Sasanian Empire. So, although they're different forms of the slave, what we can call conveniently slave mode of production, and quite different, in many respects quite different forms, in other respects actually have the same underlying economic and social foundation. And if we were to, it was easy to believe in the 19th century that the Sasanians, that the Achaemenids and the Sasanians did not have law. In the 20th century, we know that that isn't the case, because we've actually got a Sasanian fragments of a Sasanian Zoroastrian law book, which turns out to have private law about private property and contracts of sale and conveyances and leases and rent and wrongdoing and a whole load of really weird law about marriage, some of which was inherited by Islamic law. So, although we know a whole lot more about Roman law than we know about Sasanian law, because the Christians left more Roman law, made more use of Roman law than the Muslim scholars made of Iranian law. Though clearly, the Muslim scholars made a lot of use of Iranian law in constructing the various texts of Sharia. It's more hidden, so we think of Rome as a society which involves private property slavery, and Sasanian Iran we think of in terms of the discourses of the Greek and Roman historians as Oriental despotism without property with the state, etc., etc., etc. And so the question is then, however, nonetheless, as a theoretical category, what is meant by the Asiatic mode of production. It's a society in which you have communal property in the villages, like the Russian Mir, or, I'm sorry to say, like the open field system in the manor in medieval England. And superimposed on this is not a private property owning class, but a state. And the state performs collective organisation of irrigation, which is necessary in where you have irrigated agriculture. It's argued that where you need irrigated agriculture, you have to have this highly elaborated state in order to organise the irrigated agriculture. And the state exploits the peasantry directly. The villages are atomized and unconnected with each other, and the state directly exploits the peasantry, and there is no class, private property owning class, separate from the state.
Tax farmers.
Tax farmers, in a sense, are simply emanations of the state. The exploiting class is the... Yeah. When you have tax farmers, proper tax farmers, actually that presupposes that you've got a private monetary economy, whether it's a Roman style, the monetary, sort of monetary economy with which we're familiar in Greece and Rome, or whether it's a monetary economy in the modern sense. Okay, so then if it were the case that Russia didn't, it might be the case that Russia didn't become fully capitalist because it was the Asiatic mode, because it was an Asiatic mode of production, and because the Asiatic mode of production is terribly ancient and terribly static, because the constraints of irrigated agriculture are so harsh. In relation to Russia, we have to substitute something for irrigated agriculture because it's plain it's not a country of irrigated agriculture. The something which we substitute is the Mongols and other barbarians sitting on the steppe and constantly raiding into Russia, which means that we have to have hypertrophy state apparatus with a very big military, and in consequence the state and its very big military directly exploits the isolated peasant communes. So that hence, therefore, as Boris put it, the modernisation would have to come from outside, would have to come from the West. There's debate about this stuff, really a very obscure debate about this stuff among Russian leftists. Because Boris's book makes heavy use of Mikhail Pokrovsky, who was a Bolshevik historian, who wrote about medieval Russia. Then after the revolution wrote a short course textbook. He wrote 4 volumes on medieval and early modern Russia. And then after the revolution, he wrote a short course textbook which carried the story down to and after the revolution. Pokrovsky got into a violent debate with Trotsky at the time of the republication of Trotsky's 1905, because Trotsky adopted the Milyukov, Russian liberal Milyukov's, historian Milyukov's theory that Russia was Asiatic, and capitalism would come to Russia from outside. And Pokrovsky didn't agree with that. And this violent debate, it's not... Pokrovsky, in fact, became a Stalinist in the faction fight in the 1920s. But actually, Pokrovsky was at outs with Trotsky well before anybody was saying, oh, there's a great campaign against Trotsky being run. Pokrovsky's being at outs with Trotsky is about issues between Pokrovsky and Trotsky, but it then later becomes part of the debate, the Trotsky-Stalin debate. And then, of course, actually, very shortly afterwards, Pokrovsky dies, I think, in 1931, and he is posthumously purged.
It was very lucky.
Benefit which he shared with Bolshevik jurist Stuchka, who happened to die early enough not to be sent to a camp.
But still, he was denounced officially.
But still, officially denounced.
And some of his pupils were sent to camps, actually.
Yeah.
Or they had to denounce their teacher.
Yeah. So, the Pokrovsky-Trotsky debate is connected with, well, it has 2 things, one of which is at an extraordinarily superficial level, is that I think Pokrovsky was just personally cross with Trotsky, because here's Pokrovsky, he's a academic medievalist trained under Paul Vinogradov and under Kluchevsky, and he writes 4 volumes from a Marxist point of view on the history of medieval and early modern Russia. And then Trotsky, in the writings in 1905, just lifts from Milyukov, liberal historian Milyukov, without bothering to refer to Pokrovsky. Now, okay, when Trotsky originally wrote that in those essays in 1905, 6, 7, that was reasonable enough. But in 1920, for Trotsky to republish the stuff without referring to Pokrovsky is an insult, and it's just from the point of view of serious scientific work, which Chris and I was talking about yesterday, it's unscientific. So Trotsky wrote in an afterword in the second edition, in the next edition of 1905, in which he responded to Pokrovsky's criticism and made a little bit more of an attempt to defend the characterization of Russia as semi-Asiatic. How did that bear on strategy? I'm not sure it bore on strategy quite the same way that Boris said, because it seems to me, reading Lenin, Two Tactics and various other writings of that period, and for that matter, the development of capitalism in Russia, that what Lenin thought was that there was actually an endogenous development of capitalism in Russia. It was historically behind the development of capitalism in the West, and it was in many respects similar to the development of capitalism in the West. And in that sense, it was merchant-led. It involved what was called in this country the putting out system, and agricapitalism, the development of agricapitalism, rather than being a development immediately of full industrial capitalism, whereas the industrial capitalism was largely, genuinely was, imported French, British, German capital in the central cities. But Lenin thought there was an endogenous development of capitalism in Russia, and that gave rise to the fact that there was an objective dynamic towards a capitalist revolution in Russia. And the working class had choices about what sort of capitalist revolution it would be. Would it be an English-style capitalist revolution in which the peasantry got driven off the land and converted into proletarians? Would it be a French-style capitalist revolution in which there was a really radical democratic movement and the emancipation of the peasantry? Would it be a German-style capitalist revolution, in which case it wasn't really a revolution at all, it was the imposition of capitalist modernization under the head of the autocratic regime? So there was going to be a bourgeois revolution, come what may. That was the dynamic, that was the objective dynamic, and there was going to be, and the proletariat had to intervene in this situation. The proletariat's choice was essentially as to what sort of revolution it was going to be. And the proletariat could get the better sort of revolution for itself, which was a radical democratic capitalist revolution in which the peasantry was emancipated, in which radical democracy emerged. And the way the proletariat could get that was by alliance with the peasantry. Now, Trotsky says something quite different in Results and Prospects, and also in 1905. What Trotsky says is there is not the domestic basis for a capitalist revolution in Russia like the capitalist revolution in Britain, France, or Germany. What is possible, therefore, is that there is internationally basis for the socialist revolution in Europe. And the Russian Revolution can only succeed, says Trotsky, if the proletariat takes the lead. That will involve not saying things about distributing land to the peasantry, because that would actually just muddle the affair. We should have the same program about the peasantry as the German Socialist Party. The proletariat simply takes the lead of itself. It will draw in the poorer sections of the peasantry, the semi-proletarianized peasantry, the people who are being turned into wage labourers. And the revolution will at once be socialist. But, says everybody else, if we look at the social relations in Russia, this is not an advanced capitalist country. How can it survive? Well, Trotsky actually gives explicitly the answer. We won't survive for more than a few weeks or months. We will only survive for more than a few weeks or months if the Russian Revolution triggers the revolution in Western Europe. And he says it will trigger the revolution in Western Europe, because if we have revolution in Russia, all the property of the Western capitalists in Russia will be devalorized, and there will be crashes on the London and Paris stock exchanges, which will trigger a general crisis in the revolution in Western Europe. Or alternatively, we will make the revolution in Russia, that will trigger the revolution in Russian Poland, which will trigger the revolution in German Poland, which will trigger the revolution in Germany, which will. So one way or another, we can gamble on the success of the revolution in Europe. So Lenin's line and Trotsky's line as of 1905, are really, as of the interpretation of 1905 afterwards, are really quite profoundly different. One says there's an internal dynamic towards capitalism, the other says there isn't an internal dynamic towards capitalism, but nonetheless the socialist revolution is on the agenda internationally, and we can go ahead. We can gamble on the West. In practice, they converge, because in the Second World War, Lenin comes to the conclusion, Lenin comes to the conclusion that the European Revolution is immediately on the agenda. Yeah. And Trotsky comes in behind Lenin, at least for a time, on the question of the peasantry. But the Pokrovsky stuff relates to this. The Pokrovsky question and the Asiatic mode relates to this, because the argument that Russia is Asiatic in Trotsky is Milyukov's argument. In substance, is Milyukov's argument that, and it is that capitalism comes to Russia only from the outside, and that relates to the proposition that is not an internal dynamic towards capitalism. Pokrovsky, in contrast, argues that Russia develops full feudalism in the Middle Ages, not an Asiatic mode of production. And as Boris said, that it's the integration of Russia into a capitalist market which is already dominated by central imperialist powers and inequality between nations, in subordination to the Netherlands and to Britain, which creates the appearance of an Asiatic state in the form of the early Muscovite regime, Ivan the Terrible, as well as Peter the Great, etc. That involves I'm sorry to have taken longer than I meant to, but that involves an interpretation of early capitalism, and that interpretation of early capitalism actually entails, although this isn't transparent in Pokrovsky, it's more transparent in Boris's book, that capitalism is imperialist from its beginning, that the seizure of power by a capitalist class and the creation of a capitalist state immediately in the Netherlands in the late 16th century, in England in 1688, creates an imperialist state. And imperialism and colonial subordination is not the final stage of capitalism, it is a normal feature of capitalism. Now, I have some hesitations about Pokrovsky's analysis, but my primary hesitation about Pokrovsky's analysis is I don't actually think that 13th century Russia, on his description, looks like 13th century England or France. I think it looks like 7th century England or France, like the Merovingian or Carolingian periods of what I would call early feudalism rather than high feudalism. So that I think that there is a sense in which we could still maintain the position that Russia didn't have a bourgeois revolution because it simply came to the stage of being ready for the bourgeois revolution later. I have hesitations about this one way or another. But the very fundamental point that capitalism is imperialist capitalism from the outset, and that people are able to insert themselves into the imperialist system only either by becoming imperialists, by breaking through as imperialists, as Japan did in the 1890s, 1900s, or by inserting themselves into the world capitalist system as colonial countries, that I think is fundamentally correct. And the implication of that actually is precisely the implication that Boris drew, that the idea of giving support, critical support to the section of the bourgeoisie to create the bourgeois revolution in order to modernise, etc., is a complete illusion. And further, actually, since capitalism is a world system from its outset, capitalism, as Boris actually says, can only be overthrown as a world system. It needs our coordinated effort of the international working class acting together under capitalism to overthrow capitalism. It's not a question that we overthrow capitalism in one country, then the revolution spreads to another country, to another country, to another country, to another country.
I find this a bizarre discussion, I'm sorry to say. There's not much I disagree with in the case of Boris. But with Mike, I don't really know where I am here. We spent a long time last night agreeing, actually. Well, I find it very, very odd for this simple reason. I've written an article on Trotsky in 1905, and of course spent time rereading him for the purpose. Now, the title of the article has got to do with Trotsky's understanding of finance capital. Now, finance capital, as far as I know, did not exist in the 15th century as we understand it. Or it wasn't the finance, it's not part of Asiatic mode of production, feudalism, or anything else. He's talking about the growth of finance capital as Hillel Ticktin later puts forward. He already has a concept of it. In other words, there's no question that Trotsky is talking about capitalism. He discusses it in some detail there. His whole argument is precisely that unlike Lenin, they should take power and begin the introduction of socialism. That's his argument. That is what Trotskyism is. If it's anything, that is what it is. So the idea that somehow the Asiatic mode of production was now something special, keeping it back, is fantastic. It's out of this world. I don't know where that anybody gets that. The entire basis of Trotskyism, the rest of what I've just said, that Russia was becoming capitalist indeed. There were increasing forms of capitalism. Then Trotsky in 1906, when he's writing all his notes, which I don't think they are translated, but I've read some of them, he discusses the nature of the bourgeoisie. He's not talking about merchant bourgeoisie there at all. He discusses how the bourgeoisie wants civil rights, how progressive the bourgeoisie is, and at the same time takes the view that it will not take power, it will not introduce its own program, and we all know, it's what Trotsky said 101 times, that although there was a bourgeoisie, it was developing, it would not take power. It would not take power because it knew that its opposite, the working class, was there. They didn't want to give it an opportunity, so it was not itself going to take power. That is what Trotsky was saying. That's the nature of permanent revolution itself. So I don't understand what on earth is being said if one didn't say that. That's kind of elementary. Just kind of read 1905 or anything else Trotsky said in that period. Or, of course, when he formulated the concept at the beginning of 1905 itself. If you accuse Trotsky of anything, it is of being too forward, if you want to. I don't, I'd say he's right, in arguing for taking power, precisely because there already was a working class present, because the bourgeoisie was present and was building up a working class. How can one argue anything else? Well, even when you talk about the question of other countries collapsing or whatever, the fact was the main country investing in Russia at the time, of course it was France, Germany, it was Germany and Britain, but it was France, and France lost an enormous amount, as we know, when it was expropriated. It had an enormous impact in France, which is still there today, in fact. It was ruined as an imperialist power. So saying at the time when he was 26 that this would happen was
I'm not saying he's not.
Pardon?
I'm not saying he's not.
He's not what?
I'm not saying he's not right.
Oh, okay.
Just a diversion. Yeah.
He's not right. What you were saying. Okay, so what we're discussing was whether the concept of the Asiatic mode production was any kind of obstacle, if I understand Mike, for Trotsky in relation to taking power. It wasn't none of the kind. He brings in the question simply in order to explain its backwardness. That's as far as it really goes. He doesn't go any further. In fact, as Marxist theorists, he's virtually the only Marxist theorist, Marxist, not semi-Marxist or whatever, or an empiricist writing as a Marxist of Russia. The problem with Pokrovsky is, like so many, I think, like so many people who are Marxists, he doesn't sufficiently use the Marxist categories in going through it. He just assumes, and this is what he's objecting to, he assumes the role of mercantile capitalism, and which, as Boris has rightly pointed out, he uses the basis, in fact, for saying that therefore they can take power. But Trotsky went further than Pokrovsky in that, in calling for the taking of power. The problem when you start to talk about mercantile capitalism is exactly what kind of capitalism is that? And after all, you have mercantile capitalism in the ancient mode of production too. So exactly what we mean by it, especially given the fact that generally a Marxist has to hold that the more developed is merchant capital, the less developed is capitalism. And the logical conclusion you might reach, of course, is that there was virtually nothing really effective in terms of capitalism, if you wanted to. I'm not saying that Trotsky did, he didn't, he did the opposite. But that was part of the real debate. That Trotsky, I don't know whether he actually did get the idea. Nobody's proved, of course, that he got the idea from Milyukov, but let's assume that he did. It's a fairly obvious idea to actually get. Now, he didn't get the idea that it was Asiatic as a whole. He precisely says that it isn't. It's semi-Asiatic. Now, the problem there is, what does he mean by semi-Asiatic? Well, obviously, he's referring first and foremost to the autocracy, the bureaucratic apparatus, the autocracy, the special status. By that time, of course, have already been at least technically emancipated to serve a special kind of service. It clearly wasn't the same as feudalism. To call it feudal is simply nuts, it seems to me. But it wasn't the same as feudal. It wasn't the same as feudal, but there was something else involved. So what Trotsky tried to grapple with, which is what any Marxist would have to do, was the complexity of it. It could be that the term is wrong, Asiatic, but there is something else involved, and one has to be able to analyze that, together with the development of capitalism and the feudal, whatever other aspects there actually were there. I completely agree with Mike in his early description of, in fact, time in the terrible, time of troubles and so forth, which is what he's talking about. That's true, and keep the great. But we really do have something which, in its form, in its bureaucratic form, even though you can say Henry VIII is very similar to what he's saying, I'm the terrible, and I agree, it's the same kind of process. Even so, we do, and I completely agree that in any time of transition, you have the growth of a bureaucratic apparatus. That's absolutely true. It's true of the Roman Empire, it's true of the movement from feudalism to capitalism, and it's true now we see a growth of bureaucratic apparatus. It's true, but that isn't enough to therefore argue that what existed in Russia in that period simply arose from a transition. You can do that. And what I'm trying to say, therefore, is that this is a complexity with which Trotsky was trying to deal with. He only began that process that Pokrovsky doesn't do it sufficiently. He was called, and I would uphold the term, a vulgar Marxist, both by the right and by the left, actually. And I think that's basically true, I'm sorry to say. That doesn't mean to say that one shouldn't read it. And just a digression on this. It's extremely hard to be an historian. I'm not an historian. It's extremely hard to be a Marxist historian. You have to have two qualities. One is the ability to go through empirical material well, which is tedious to say the least. And the second is you must have taken in Marxist theory sufficiently to be able to operate on it. And thirdly, to actually operate using the theoretical apparatus on empirical material, constantly changing the theoretical apparatus with the changing empirical material. That isn't an easy thing to do, and I know very few Marxist historians in that sense. I know of Marx. I know very few since then. Most historians who have written in the Marxist tradition are empiricists. They may have produced very good stuff. Well, a lot of it is Stalin stuff, which I wouldn't regard as quite so good. But there's a lot of history written by Marxists, which is really a Marxist empirical long, drawn-out account, if one can call it that. Yeah, it's perfectly useful in that form, but it isn't doing what a Marxist history ought to do. And for me, the comparison is, which links back to what we're talking about, is the last chapters of Capital Volume 1, where Marx is talking of primitive accumulation. And that, to me, is the ideal way of writing history. Okay, I'm not a historian, maybe I'm completely wrong in all this. And I set it down to Mike, who is an historian, who knows far more than I do of much of the detail. But when it comes to talking about imperialism, beginning with the beginnings of capitalism, well, that's Luxemburg's viewpoint, yes. It's perfectly possible to do that. All you do is you say, the capitalist world invades the rest of the world. It does. Of course it does. As capitalism begins, it exploits the rest of the world. That is so. Well, it depends simply on your definition of imperialism. Luxemburg had a different definition from Lenin, and simply defined it effectively as invading other countries and exploiting them. And that's the way she does it. Lenin's definition is clearly different. For that, on Lenin's definition, I won't go into the, I think everybody knows it. Obviously, it wasn't imperial. That's the difference. But if you want to say that capitalism begins, as Marx describes it, dripping with blood from head to toe, it did. We all know that. Nobody doubts it. And anybody who read Capital and Trotsky, Lenin, Potocki obviously had read Capital would know that. So that doesn't seem to me to add anything that we didn't know. But there is a difference between primitive accumulation and the later invasion in what is the classical, in Marxist terms, imperialist period. One must be able to describe exactly what that is. Can I just go on to the next aspect, although one can go on talking this forever. Part of the reason for the importance of the term, the Asiatic mode of production, was that it got banned in the Soviet Union in the late 20s. Because a group of people working on it were obviously thinking of the Soviet Union. And not unsurprisingly, it got banned by Stalin. So the term vanished. It didn't just vanish the Soviet Union, of course, given the controls of this point, it vanished throughout the world. Marxists just stopped using it. So the only person using it was Trotsky, effectively. And so he effectively kept the term alive. Well, it was then revived in France by historians or sociologists or whatever they were. I think it was in the 60s, in the 60s. They revived it. There was a congress around it, a congress around it. They revived the term and they decided, yes, it existed, but it existed before the evolution of class society. Now, of course, that was a wonderful compromise, because obviously that couldn't have applied to the Soviet Union, and nor would it even apply to Russia. So they actually dealt with the concept quite efficiently by removing it. Later, by the 60s, it was again being revived as a description of the Soviet Union. Rudy Dushko, if you remember him, did have that viewpoint, did regard the Soviet Union as a form of Asiatic mode of production. Mike has defined some of the characteristics of it, but of course some of them couldn't possibly apply simply because of the nature of what it must have been, because most people regard it at least as regarded at most as parallel to feudalism. But what they were really taking from it was the strong state, the bureaucratic apparatus, the autocrat, and I suppose the relatively high rate of exploitation, and to a degree, of course, the atomization which existed in the Soviet Union. Now, I don't agree with it, but it did become fairly popular. And before him, of course, you know, Wittfogel, and the viewpoint existed in kind of odd circles, but by '68 it became much more important, particularly because of Dushko. And Critique itself had a couple of articles on it, which is how I got to understand it, so far as I do understand it. And so it was, I think, '77, we had an article by Marion Sawyer precisely on this topic of the Asiatic mode of production. And she goes into detail on it. And I think I wrote something myself. If anybody wants to read more detail, apart from Marx's many manuscripts, which you can spend the rest of your life studying on the subject, there's a guy called Lawrence Crader, who's written almost as much as Marx on the subject. And we can get into some detail about it. It seems to me you can't simply write the thing off, which is what I think is being partly proposed here. I hope I've dealt with the question of Trotsky. You can't simply write it off as not existing. At one level, of course, it's an empirical question. Was India or China something which corresponds to this idea of the Oriental despot who owns all the land, who takes a tax in return for giving the possession of the land to the ordinary peasant, who justifies it with a bureaucratic apparatus which takes care of some central factor involved with agriculture, like irrigation? Were the villages themselves autarkic or relatively independent? That's to say, in the village you had the artisans. The artisans weren't in the towns. The towns tend to be administrative centres. Well, the question is whether some form of this, obviously the total form probably would be hard to find in its totality, but that's, so especially some form of that actually existed. Well, it's an empirical question at the end that one would have to investigate, and I have to admit that Mike knows a lot more than I do about the history of China, for instance, which I find very difficult to discover. I find it very difficult to discover a good book on the subject, I have to say, however much I've tried. But anyway, and obviously better knowledge, and obviously far better knowledge in terms of the ancient mode of production. So I doubt his empirical understanding of it. But I have to add two things. One is that all modes of production before capitalism, as Marx points out, contained a series of different forms of exploitation. So in ancient mode of production, you have, as it were, free labor, you have serfdom, and you have slavery. I think it's accepted, Marx makes it explicit. And of course, it's obvious that that is the case. I'm saying this because if you then look at China or India, you see more than, in any case, you see more than what I've just said. Just, you have a caste system in India, which is invention, of course, in Asian mode of production. So that is different. But it is acceptable within the theory if you say there are going to be a whole series of other forms existing. And of course, you could then say, well, the Asiatic mode of production aspect is only partial or whatever. The problem that we've got is that leaving out the history of Western Europe, leaving out the history of Western Europe, practically everywhere else is much more complex. And we can't simply say it is A, B, or C, or D. And we have to deal with that complexity and show the different forms. And above all, what we're talking about, remember, Marx says what is defined as the voluntary capital, I think everybody knows, is the form of the surplus product. And in this case, we're talking of taxation. Mike says, well, you can see taxation elsewhere. Yes, you can, of course. The question is how common it is, how important that is, and so on. And go into detail. Again, in the end, once one's got the concept itself, which, and I've given one account of it, I think one has to go into much more detail and much deeper research to get a full account of what one would imagine being, what one would think of, or what one construct as Asiatic mode of production. The question, how far then does it apply empirically to whichever country you find? Well, it may be that today, in terms of the knowledge we now have, it no longer can be said to apply or have ever applied. It may be the case, but in order to do that, you would really have to have a proper study of a country over time and try to understand it. I think that's true. I think what Trotsky did there by using that term was try and establish the complexity of Russia and the pre-revolutionary Russia, which is true. I don't think there's any way around it. And I think in doing that, although he was just 26 and just as it were, couldn't have known that much, he did make a considerable contribution. Thanks.